True crime. The Lindsay Clancy case. The house that fell silent. What happened during the dinner run? The family routine. The 44-minute errand. And the question a jury must answer. On a Tuesday afternoon in Duxbury, Massachusetts, a little boy manages to dress himself. Dawson Clancy is 3 years old. His father, Patrick, takes a photograph and sends it to his wife. Lindsay is at a pediatric appointment with their 5-year-old daughter, Cora, who poses in a patient gown and mask. The parents exchange pictures. The messages are clear. The day is moving through its ordinary checkpoints. Later, Cora and Dawson play outside in the snow. 8-month-old Callan needs rocking. Dawson eats chicken nuggets on the couch. Dinner has not been cooked, so Lindsay suggests takeout from a restaurant the family knows but does not usually use for a quick meal. Patrick holds the baby, kisses Cora on the head, and says he will be right back. He is also collecting children's medicine from a pharmacy. Lindsay places the food order. Nothing in their brief exchanges sounds like an alarm. Patrick leaves shortly after 5:15. In less than an hour, the family's home will become the center of a question that medicine cannot answer by itself, and the law cannot avoid. What was happening inside Lindsay Clancy's mind while the house appeared calm? The life before the case. The Clancy home is not best understood through the images that would later be entered into evidence. Before investigators, lawyers, and experts reduce its contents to exhibits, it is a family house crowded with the possessions of 3 very young children. Cora is 5, the eldest. Family descriptions and trial testimony present her as bright, affectionate, and drawn to sparkly dresses and baby dolls. She is old enough to have preferences, routines, and a recognizable sense of humor. She is also young enough that a trip to the doctor becomes something her parents document and share. Dawson is 3, energetic and fascinated by trucks. Patrick later describes him as naturally funny and generous. The photograph of him proudly wearing clothes he put on himself captures the scale on which a 3-year-old's achievements are measured. One small act of independence, important enough to send to Mom. Callan, born in May of 2022, is the baby. Patrick describes him as easygoing and capable of lifting his mood simply by being held. The family feels lucky after his arrival. That summer, Patrick would later testify, is among their happiest. Lindsay works as a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. Her profession matters, but it should not be turned into a simplistic symbol. Training in maternity care does not make a person immune from psychiatric illness, nor does it prove that every symptom would be recognized in oneself. What her work does establish is a life built around responsibility, clinical routines, and the care of mothers and babies. At home, Patrick's account is of a highly involved parent. Lindsay reads to the children from infancy, invents songs, and makes green eggs and ham because Cora likes the book. Years of photographs and social media posts show outings, birthdays, and affection. They do not settle what happened later. They establish that the children's lives were larger than the final evening, and that Lindsay's relationship with them cannot honestly be compressed into a single hostile phrase. The family appears full, busy, and secure. Then, during the autumn after Callan's birth, ordinary pressure begins to acquire a different weight. The people around them. Patrick and Lindsay met in 2013 and married 3 years later. By the time Callan arrives, their household has 3 children under 6, overlapping sleep schedules, and the practical strain familiar to families with a newborn. Patrick takes paternity leave and later works from home. Relatives help. A part-time nanny is involved. Support exists, but support and illness are not opposites. One does not automatically cancel the other. Patrick becomes the person closest to Lindsay's changing condition. His evidence is powerful precisely because it refuses to fit neatly on one side of the case. He sees worsening anxiety, insomnia, weight loss, and depression. He hears references to suicide and intrusive thoughts. Yet he also sees her prepare meals, organize the children, and behave as a devoted mother. He does not see her harm them. No clinician tells him that she must not be left alone with them. Lindsay's parents are also part of the support structure. Friends see the family socially. Healthcare professionals enter the picture in growing numbers: psychiatrists, prescribers, emergency staff, a specialist women's behavioral health program, and, eventually, an inpatient psychiatric hospital. That network later becomes important for two different reasons. The defense says it demonstrates repeated efforts to obtain help and a system that never identified the full danger. Prosecutors say it shows that trained professionals repeatedly assessed Lindsay without finding the psychosis, now said to explain her actions. Both propositions can sound persuasive in isolation. Neither is the complete record. Psychiatric symptoms may fluctuate, patients may underreport them, and clinicians can miss risk. Equally, later catastrophe does not prove that every earlier clinical decision was negligent, or that psychosis was present throughout. The social world around the Clancys, therefore, contains care, observation, and blind spots at the same time. People are watching. People are trying to help. Yet no one around the family understands the evening that is approaching in the same way it will later be described in court. The first cracks. By late September of 2022, Lindsay is anxious about returning to work after maternity leave. She sees psychiatric providers and is initially diagnosed, according to the prosecution's account, with generalized anxiety disorder. Medication follows. Over several months, she receives prescriptions for antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, sleep medicines, a mood stabilizer, and an antipsychotic. The defense has emphasized the total number of different drugs prescribed across the period. That total is striking. But it does not mean she took every drug simultaneously. Patrick testified that the active combinations changed and that discontinued bottles were retained for disposal. Sleep becomes a central problem. Patrick recalls a period in which Lindsay goes roughly 2 days without sleep and attends an emergency department. He describes her becoming intensely anxious, losing weight, and sometimes rocking on the sofa with her head beneath a pillow. After a difficult reaction associated in their account with Seroquel, she begins reporting suicidal thoughts and intrusive thoughts involving harm to the children, while denying any plan to act. Her private notes complicate the picture. In October, she writes that she thinks she may resent Cora and Dawson because they prevent her from treating Callan as she treated her first baby. The same entry acknowledges that the feeling is unfair, describes depression, and ends with a wish to feel love and connection with all 3 children. Prosecutors treat the resentment as evidence of a motive. The fuller passage can also be read as a distressed mother recognizing and resisting an unwanted feeling. In December, she is assessed at a specialist women's behavioral health program. The prosecution's early account said clinicians did not find postpartum depression. A later civil complaint portrays the encounter and subsequent coordination of care differently. Those competing descriptions are allegations and interpretations, not findings already made by the criminal jury. Around New Year, Lindsay admits herself to McLean Hospital amid suicidal thinking. She is discharged after several days without an assessment that she poses a danger to herself or others, according to the account presented at her initial court appearance. By mid-January, she tells Patrick the suicidal thoughts have stopped. The apparent improvement is real enough to reassure the person standing closest to her. Whether it reflects recovery, concealment, or a changing illness is one of the questions the later evidence must confront. Court record chronology of Lindsay's treatment. The last ordinary movements. 2 days before the central event, the Clancys take Cora and Dawson to dinner at the home of Patrick's college friend. The friend later describes Lindsay as appearing fairly normal. Patrick discusses her anxiety and his concern that medication is not helping, but the gathering does not become an emergency. The next day, Lindsay writes that she has what she calls a touch of postpartum anxiety connected to returning to work. The phrase sounds mild, beside the crisis described by her defense. Prosecutors can argue it shows accurate self-awareness rather than psychosis. The defense can argue that psychiatric illness is not reliably measured by the gentleness of a note. On Tuesday, the family follows a busy but coherent routine. Lindsay takes Cora to the pediatrician. Patrick stays with Dawson and Callan. The couple trade photographs and messages. Later, the older children play in the snow. Patrick describes Lindsay as happy, engaged, and perhaps having one of her best days in months. Shortly before 5, Lindsay contacts a pharmacy about a stool softener for Cora. The manager later says the conversation sounds normal. Lindsay then asks Patrick to collect the medicine and pick up dinner from 3V in Plymouth. She calls the restaurant herself and places the order. Patrick leaves at approximately 5:15. Pharmacy footage places him in the children's medication aisle a little after 1:30. When the exact brand is unavailable, he calls Lindsay. She does not answer, then returns the call roughly a minute later. They speak for about 14 seconds. She agrees to a generic product. Patrick thinks she sounds quiet and occupied, perhaps bathing the children, but coherent. He leaves the pharmacy and drives to the restaurant. Surveillance and transaction records trace an uneventful errand. At 3V, he pays for the food and starts home. That evidence provides a narrow window of about 44 minutes between Patrick's departure and return. The prosecution sees a deliberately created opportunity. The defense sees the interval in which an untreated psychotic command overwhelmed a mother who had spent months seeking help. At approximately 6:09, Patrick arrives at a house that no longer sounds occupied. The first alarm. Patrick calls out. There is no reply. The children are not in their bedrooms or the upstairs bathroom. A call to Lindsay's phone goes unanswered. The door to the main bedroom is locked. When Patrick gains access, he sees blood and an open second-floor window. Outside, Lindsay is lying on her back in the yard, with deep wounds to her wrists and a wound across her neck. She tells Patrick that she tried to kill herself. When he asks where the children are, she directs him to the basement. Patrick calls emergency services. Once responders begin treating Lindsay, he goes downstairs. He finds Cora and Callan together on the basement floor. Dawson is in Patrick's home office. Each child has an exercise resistance band tightened around the neck. The emergency call records his discovery in real time. The judge allowed jurors to hear it, but restricted public access to the recording, recognizing the children's dignity and Patrick's privacy. In court, its importance is not that grief proves a disputed fact. It establishes the sequence of discovery, Patrick's immediate perception, and the chaos into which the first responders arrived. Police officers, firefighters, and paramedics move between the yard and basement. Resuscitation begins. Cora and Dawson are transported to a hospital in Plymouth, where doctors continue advanced life support but cannot restore them. Both are pronounced dead that evening. Callan's pulse is recovered, and he is transferred to Boston Children's Hospital with catastrophic oxygen deprivation injury. 3 days later, testing establishes that Callan has suffered brain death. After consultation with Patrick, life support is withdrawn. The medical examiner determines that Cora and Dawson died from asphyxia, and that Callan died from complications of asphyxia. Those findings were later included in the official indictment announcement. Official charging and medical findings. The question is no longer what happened to the children. It is how the person responsible should be understood under criminal law. The search for an explanation. Investigators secure the house and collect physical, digital, and medical evidence. The exercise bands are preserved. Police photograph the rooms, Lindsay's injuries, and the children's clothing. Blood and urine taken during Lindsay's hospital treatment are retained under warrant. Phones, a shared tablet, handwritten notes, medication containers, and online activity become possible routes into a mental state no witness directly observed. The first explanation offered by the physical scene is deliberate violence followed by a serious suicide attempt. There is no unknown intruder to search for. Lindsay tells Patrick where the children are. Her lawyers no longer dispute that she caused their deaths. The investigation, therefore, turns quickly from identity to intent and responsibility. Lindsay survives, but suffers a severe spinal injury and paralysis after leaving the second-floor window. At the hospital, she is sedated and, according to officers who guarded her, largely unresponsive. One officer has described a medical emergency serious enough to trigger a code blue response. Her later account introduces the case's defining claim. During a call with Patrick in the presence of a defense psychologist, she says that after he left, she heard a male voice telling her this was her last chance and directing her to kill the children so that she could kill herself. Patrick says Lindsay had never previously told him she heard voices and had not used the word psychosis with him before the event. That timing supplies the prosecution with an obvious challenge. The most specific evidence of a command hallucination comes from the accused after the acts, during contact involving a defense professional. Yet, late disclosure is not automatically invention. People experiencing psychosis may conceal or struggle to explain symptoms. Severe injury, sedation, and shock can also affect when an account emerges. The investigation cannot resolve that conflict simply by deciding whether the voice sounds believable. It must examine whether the wider record makes the claim medically and behaviorally coherent. The evidence that did not fit. The evidence contains no single piece that performs the work of a confession to calculated murder or a scan that proves psychosis. Instead, almost every major fact carries a competing interpretation. The errand looks planned because Lindsay selects both the pharmacy item and a restaurant that keeps Patrick away long enough for the acts to occur. She checks the pharmacy, calls the restaurant, and appears to act within a compressed window. Prosecutors say this is purposeful isolation of the children. The defense answers that practical organization can exist inside psychosis. A person may perform familiar tasks and still act under a delusion or hallucination. It also points out that Patrick had left Lindsay alone with the children on many earlier occasions, including overnight, without harm. If she had maintained a settled plan for weeks, opportunities already existed. The 14-second phone call is equally double-edged. Lindsay sounds coherent, while Patrick is at the pharmacy. That supports the prosecution's claim that she is rational and aware. It does not, by itself, disclose what she is doing or thinking. Patrick's impression that she sounds occupied may become important, but it cannot establish the exact sequence in the basement. Digital evidence has generated more heat than certainty. A shared tablet contained a search relating to suicide methods. Patrick denied making such a search, but testified that he had searched for a country singer who died by suicide, allowing the defense to suggest an accidental link. Someone also accessed Lindsay's social media account on the device that day. Attribution, context, and intent must therefore be proved rather than assumed. Medication evidence has the same problem. A bag of partly used prescriptions may suggest non-compliance until placed beside Patrick's explanation that the drugs had been discontinued and were awaiting disposal. Empty bottles in a bedside drawer may support compliance, but do not prove every dose. A long prescription history demonstrates complex treatment. It does not independently establish that medication caused psychosis. The evidence refuses to become simple. That is why the case belongs to a jury, rather than to a diagnosis made in a comment thread. The event at the center of the case. No surviving witness saw what happened after Patrick left the house. The event must be reconstructed from Lindsay's account. The locations of the children, the bands, medical findings, the home's condition, device records, and the available time. The defense does not dispute the essential physical acts. Lindsay placed exercise resistance bands around the necks of Cora, Dawson, and Callan, and applied pressure sufficient to deprive them of oxygen. Cora and Callan were later found near one another on the basement floor. Dawson was in the adjoining home office area. Precisely which child was approached first, what was said, and how each was moved has not been established by an independent eyewitness. Prosecutors allege the children were killed one by one in an efficient sequence while Patrick was deliberately kept away. They rely on the choice of errands, Lindsay's coherent calls, the speed of the acts, and her history of controlling household routines. Their theory is that she no longer wanted the life she had built, and decided that no one else could care for the children to her standards. The defense rejects that motive. It says the command Lindsay later described arrived after Patrick left, a loud, repetitive male voice telling her she had to act immediately. In that account, the children were not killed because she stopped loving them, but because a severe psychiatric episode destroyed her capacity to appreciate or resist what she was doing. After the children were incapacitated, Lindsay went upstairs. The physical evidence shows wounds to her wrists and neck, and the defense has pointed to a knife, medication, and residue photographed in the bedroom. She then went through the window and fell to the ground below. The attempt caused paralysis. Whether its severity strengthens the defense theory of a shared psychotic command, or simply shows despair after intentional killings, is itself contested. The physical reconstruction proves purposeful movements, securing bands, moving through the house, inflicting injuries, and going to the window. But purposeful movement is not identical to criminal responsibility. The legal issue is not whether her body carried out a sequence. It is whether mental disease or defect left her with substantial capacity to understand the wrongfulness of that sequence or conform her conduct to law. That distinction is the narrow bridge between an undisputed act and a disputed murder conviction. When the story broke open, Duxbury first knew the case through emergency vehicles, a police perimeter, and the almost incomprehensible fact that 3 siblings had been taken from the same home. Public attention widened after officials identified Cora, Dawson, and Callan and announced criminal charges. Patrick's first substantial public statement resisted the transformation of his children into a collective headline. He described Cora's beauty and affection, Dawson's humor and generosity, and Callan's calming presence. He wrote about the separate experience of loving each child. He also asked people to forgive Lindsay as he had, describing the person he knew as loving and caring toward family, friends, and patients. That appeal divided public reaction. Some interpreted forgiveness as evidence that Patrick believed illness had replaced intent. Others thought compassion for Lindsay displaced the children. Neither reaction determines the case. Patrick is a bereaved father, a witness, and later a civil claimant. He is not the legal decision-maker. The case also became a vessel for arguments about motherhood, medication, and postpartum mental health. Some discussion treated postpartum psychosis as a complete explanation before expert evidence was heard. Other discussion treated coherent behavior as proof that psychosis was impossible. Both positions outran the record. Postpartum psychosis is real, rare, and dangerous. Medical reviews estimate that it affects roughly 1 or 2 people per 1,000 births, and may involve delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, severe mood disturbance, and disorganized thinking. It is considered a psychiatric emergency. Most people with the condition do not harm their children, and the existence of the diagnosis in general cannot establish that Lindsay met the legal test at a particular moment. Clinical review of postpartum psychosis. The public debate wants a category: monster or patient. The trial must do harder work with evidence. The case built from fragments. A grand jury indicted Lindsay in September of 2023 on 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of strangulation. She pleaded not guilty. The case eventually reached a jury in Plymouth Superior Court in July of 2026, with Judge William Sullivan presiding. Official indictment announcement. The parties agree that Lindsay killed the children. Her defense's lack of criminal responsibility, commonly called an insanity defense. Under Massachusetts law, once the issue is properly raised, the defendant does not carry the burden of proving herself legally insane. The Commonwealth must prove criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal test is more exacting than asking whether Lindsay had a psychiatric diagnosis. A person lacks criminal responsibility if, because of mental disease or defect, she lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate that her conduct was wrong or to conform her conduct to the requirements of law. The state's current model homicide instructions emphasize that criminal responsibility is a legal judgment and that the defendant bears no burden to prove its absence. Massachusetts Criminal Responsibility Instructions. The prosecution says Lindsay was depressed and anxious but not psychotic. It points to organization, concealment, the errand, normal conversations, the absence of documented hallucinations before the event, and notes expressing resentment. Its opening portrayed her as controlling and manipulative, allegations the jury must test rather than accept. The defense says the months of insomnia, suicidal thinking, intrusive thoughts, changing medication, and repeated attempts to obtain care culminated in postpartum psychosis associated with bipolar illness. It argues that her serious attempt to die was genuine, that she had no rational motive to kill children she loved, and that medical providers failed to recognize the crisis. Opening arguments and Patrick Clancy's testimony. Expert testimony will matter, but experts do not issue the verdict. The jury must decide whether the Commonwealth has closed the gap between evidence of action and proof of criminal responsibility. The outcome the jury has not yet reached. As of the 3rd of August, 2026, there is no verdict. The trial has entered its second week. Jurors have heard opening statements, Patrick's evidence, the restricted emergency call and testimony from police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and doctors. They have visited the former Clancy home, the pharmacy, and the restaurant, so that distance, layout, and timing can be assessed directly. The early witnesses have largely established the family routine, the errand, the emergency response, and the medical consequences. Doctors described prolonged attempts to resuscitate Cora and Dawson. Specialists caring for Callan explained the devastating oxygen deprivation injury that led to the determination of brain death. This evidence is emotionally overwhelming, but Judge Sullivan has reminded jurors that emotion must be separated from the informational value of each exhibit and witness. The most contested psychiatric evidence still has to be weighed in full. The trial was expected to last several weeks and potentially involve a very large witness list. Current testimony, therefore, cannot responsibly be treated as a preview of an inevitable result. Current trial status and testimony. If jurors convict Lindsay of first-degree murder, the consequence could be life imprisonment without parole. If they find that the Commonwealth has not proved criminal responsibility, a verdict of not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility would not mean that the acts did not occur. It would lead into the state's mental health commitment process, with confinement and future review governed by dangerousness and treatment law, rather than a prison sentence. Until the jury hears the complete case, any declaration that justice requires one result is advocacy, not outcome. The aftermath, people still argue about. The legal case took more than 3 years to reach trial. During that period, Lindsay remained paralyzed and was held in a state hospital. Patrick divorced her, later remarried, and moved forward with a life permanently divided from the one shown in the family photographs. Forgiveness did not end his search for accountability. In early 2026, Patrick filed a wrongful death action against several clinicians and healthcare organizations involved in Lindsay's treatment. Lindsay filed a related medical malpractice claim. The complaints allege fragmented care, misdiagnosis, inappropriate medication changes, inadequate monitoring, and failures to respond to escalating symptoms. Those civil allegations are not proven facts. The providers have the right to contest negligence, causation, and the plaintiff's account of the clinical record. The criminal jury is not deciding whether a clinician breached a professional duty, and a civil court will not decide Lindsay's criminal responsibility. Yet the proceedings overlap around a disturbing practical question. How could a person report insomnia, suicidal thinking, and intrusive thoughts, pass through several forms of care, and still return to a home with 3 young children without a shared safety plan that prevented the final crisis? The answer may reveal missed warning signs. It may also reveal the limits of retrospective certainty. Mental health professionals make risk decisions with incomplete information, and a catastrophic outcome can make earlier ambiguity look falsely obvious. For the community, there is no comparable legal framework for aftermath. Cora, Dawson, and Callan are remembered together because they died together, but Patrick's descriptions insist on their separateness. A girl in a sparkly dress, a boy delighted by trucks, a baby able to soften a bad day. Any serious account of the case must keep returning to those 3 lives, not only to the woman whose state of mind now occupies the courtroom. The unanswered question behind the diagnosis. The phrase postpartum psychosis carries enormous explanatory force, but the jury cannot use it as a substitute for analysis. Clinically, postpartum psychosis usually emerges rapidly after childbirth and is strongly associated with bipolar spectrum illness. Callan was 8 months old when the children were killed, making the course, timing, and diagnostic formulation matters for expert evidence rather than assumptions. The defense's position is not merely that Lindsay was stressed after having a baby. It is that postpartum-related bipolar illness, sleep disruption, and medication exposure produced a psychotic state severe enough to remove criminal responsibility at the exact time of the acts. The prosecution does not need to prove that Lindsay was perfectly healthy. A person may be anxious, depressed, suicidal, or psychiatrically unwell, and still remain legally responsible. Conversely, the defense does not need to show that she was visibly incoherent every minute of the day. Psychosis can coexist with apparently organized behavior. Several popular shortcuts therefore fail. Planning does not automatically disprove psychosis, because delusional acts can be organized. A suicide attempt does not automatically prove psychosis, because people may attempt suicide for many reasons. A list of medications does not prove adverse causation. A lack of earlier recorded hallucinations does not prove that none occurred. Loving social media posts do not exclude resentment, while one entry about resentment does not establish a settled wish to kill. The decisive evidence is likely to come from the clinical records, toxicology, digital chronology, expert interpretation, and the credibility of Lindsay's later account of the voice. Even then, the jury will not be asked to name one morally satisfying cause. It will be asked whether prosecutors have proved, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she retained the legally required capacity. That is a narrower question than whether the healthcare system failed. It is also harder than deciding whether the public feels sympathy. Why this case still matters. The Lindsay Clancy case matters because it sits at the point where several truths that people prefer to separate may all exist together. 3 children died after resistance bands were tightened around their necks by the person responsible for protecting them. Their father discovered them and has had to describe that evening under oath. Lindsay had also spent months in visible psychiatric distress, sought professional help repeatedly, and made a grave attempt to end her own life. None of those facts erases another. The case tests whether a legal system can preserve the dignity of Cora, Dawson, and Callan without treating mental illness as a rhetorical excuse, and whether it can take severe postpartum illness seriously without assuming that diagnosis equals legal exoneration. It tests clinicians' ability to share information and assess risk across fragmented care. It tests the media's willingness to resist the easy categories of evil mother and blameless patient. It also exposes a basic misunderstanding about criminal responsibility. The question is not whether Lindsay knew how to place a food order, answer a phone, or select an exercise band. Nor is it whether she can now describe a hallucination. The question is what mental capacity she possessed during the acts, why that capacity may have been impaired, and whether the Commonwealth can prove otherwise to the standard required by law. The jury's eventual verdict will provide a legal answer. It will not recover a family, settle every medical dispute, or explain why warning signs were not assembled into a picture of danger before the house fell silent. At the beginning of the final day, Dawson dresses himself. Cora goes to an appointment. Callan is rocked in his father's arms. Those details do not soften what followed. They restore the scale of what was lost. The deepest truth in the case is not hidden in a diagnosis or an argument. It is that 3 ordinary childhoods ended inside the time it took to collect medicine and dinner.